Is Pride and Prejudice asking its early 19th century audience to throw out its traditions for courtship and marriage and the treatment of women? Was Jane Austen a radical feminist? In a word, no. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, published anonymously as by the author of Sense and Sensibility, appeared as 3 hardcover volumes, January 28, 1813. Its first 2 editions sold out over the next few years, and today scholars, critics, philosophers, and lovers of novels recommend it highly. With a working title of First Impressions, Austen began the novel in autumn of 1796, and the evidence of her letters shows it completed in summer 1797. The original manuscript is not extant, but at least 2 people have suggested First Impressions was an epistolary novel. Pride and Prejudice responds to forces that in the year it was written began challenging received ideas about societal order, governance, nature, and knowledge. Keeping in mind that Austen was not quite 21 when she began First Impressions, one can only imagine the conversation topics around the dinner table as she was growing into adulthood. One in particular, a little conflict across the pond known as the French Revolution. Of course, although once seen as divinely ordained, the French monarchy could not keep up with the demands of a growing population in which peasants and the bourgeoisie resented not having political power, while a privileged class carried on its wanton ways. Meanwhile, one of the first great post-Enlightenment feminist tracts, Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, appeared in 1792 amid the French Revolution. Wollstonecraft's emphasis in this pamphlet was to redefine the role of women in society. I don't know that Jane Austen ever read Wollstonecraft's Vindication, but some of the issues raised in the Vindication seem germane to any discussion of Pride and Prejudice. In particular, Wollstonecraft bemoans how women expend so much energy to make themselves agreeable to men, an enterprise that enslaves women. For Wollstonecraft, women should be afforded the same practical worldly educational opportunities as men. In Pride and Prejudice, a conversation arises early in the novel regarding the traits of a, quote, accomplished woman. In Chapter 8, Charles Bingley lists the abilities of accomplished women. They all paint tables, he says, cover screens, and net purses. His sister adds to the list. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word accomplished. Most of these attributes, of course, are intended to make a female fit company for a gentleman, and the education to produce such women is precisely the one Wollstonecraft argues against. A key epistemological question arises. Upon what authority does the aforementioned definition of an accomplished woman proceed? Why was such a mindset passed down through the generations? It might help to view a diagram of the great chain of being, which was promulgated by the Catholic Church and drove Western humankind's view of the cosmos, from Aristotle all the way up to the Enlightenment. Of course, at the top of the chain is God. What else would be there? According to Wikipedia, the chain was decreed from God in the minds of medieval Christians. Next would be the Son, and beneath him would be the archangels, Gabriel, Michael, and so on. Then there would be the warring class of angels, the seraphim, and the cherubim would answer to the seraphs. Then there would be lesser orders of angels, of course. So much for the divine realm. Now in the mortal realm, the king would be closest to God, but the Pope would almost be as close in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Cardinals would answer to the Pope. Make no mistake about it, the cardinals were indeed quite powerful, as it was they who selected the Pope. Archbishops would answer to the cardinals. Bishops to the archbishops, and the priests would be below them. Meanwhile, there are monastic orders, such as Jesuits. The head of a monastery would be its abbot, and the head of a nunnery or priory would be the prioress, and they would oversee their respective monks and nuns. Beneath the priest would be your local village parson, and of course, your parish clerk. Meanwhile, beneath the king would be dukes, somewhat analogous to governors. Then there would be powerful marquesses over the earls, who would be your local nobles. And there would be viscounts, and then barons, and lesser orders of nobility, such as a knight. Below the noble class would be high-ranking officials, and beneath them would be wealthy landowners, the gentry, who sometimes would also be officials, such as the sheriff. Then there are craftsmen and peasants, and the lowest would be serfs, who owned nothing their whole lives. Beneath humans would be the most useful animals, livestock, but certainly a cow is higher than a chicken, as it is worth more. Then the other animals, but again, a deer is worth more than a tadpole. As for plants, a tree is worth more than a weed, clearly. And then there are of course, rocks below the plants, which are useful for building things. You could build a building or a wall. And finally, there is a woman. Yes, I placed the woman below a rock. In some ways, a woman was seen more as a liability than an asset. And this was certainly the case for the Bennet family, whose primary urgency in the novel is to marry off the 5 daughters in due course. Now, I am exaggerating. Remember, though, families paid dowries to get someone to marry their daughters, but they got paid if someone wanted their livestock. Underlying Pride and Prejudice is the conflict that the Bennet estate is legally entailed. Entailment is a system that limits inheritance to specific heirs. In the novel, it is clear that the estate may not pass down to an unmarried female. This is why the slimy Mr. Collins, a cousin, comes sniffing around. He knows that as the next male heir in the family tree, he will inherit the estate if none of the daughters get married before Mr. Bennet dies. He purports to be doing the family a kindness in making his proposal to Elizabeth. Certainly the issue of the entailment would be relieved with this marriage taking place. Mrs. Bennet's emotional meltdown when Elizabeth rejects Collins may strike some readers as overdramatic, but perhaps Mrs. Bennet is the one most cognizant of the consequences if father dies before a marriage. She would be without anything in such a case.